HOA Karen breaks into my garage with her universal code. She had no idea I designed the system. You ever think you've seen it all when it comes to nosy neighbors? Well, let me tell you about the day my HOA Karen thought she was clever enough to outsmart me. She waltzed right into my garage, bragging about some so-called universal code she had. What she didn't know was that I designed the system myself. And what happened next turned her smug little plan into the biggest mistake of her life. Karen had always been the type of neighbor who couldn't stand the idea of someone else living their life without her watchful eye hovering nearby. From the very beginning, she carried herself like the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, strutting around with a clipboard tucked under her arm and a smug smile that suggested she knew better than everyone else. She wasn't just nosy. She was determined to control every little detail that happened within the boundaries of the HOA. And if you so much as stepped an inch outside her imaginary lines, she'd be on you like a hawk. People in the community whispered about her, trading stories about how she had forced one family to repaint their fence 3 times because she didn't like the shade, or how she had once stood outside a neighbor's house with a measuring tape, ensuring that their holiday decorations didn't exceed the HOA guidelines. It was never about following rules for Karen. It was about flexing her authority, about feeding her ego with the illusion that she ran the place. What made her obsession worse was her constant need to remind everyone of her supposed influence. She would casually drop phrases like, "As someone who has close ties to the HOA board," or, "I'll make sure the association hears about this," even though no one had ever confirmed if she actually had any real connections. For most of us, living in the neighborhood meant trying to keep the peace, mowing the lawn regularly, keeping our trash bins tidy, and maybe saying hello to the neighbors. But for Karen, it was a full-time mission to monitor, report, and control. I lost count of how many times I caught her peering through her blinds as if she were conducting some kind of covert surveillance operation. She kept a logbook, I'm sure of it, documenting who parked where, how long visitors stayed, and whether your grass was a fraction too high at first. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just one of those overly enthusiastic HOA types. But it became clear that her obsession wasn't simply about maintaining standards. It was about power. She thrived on the idea that people feared her, that homeowners hesitated before making any change to their property, worrying that Karen's watchful eyes would catch them. I remember one neighbor mentioning that they avoided hosting barbecues just to keep Karen from filing a noise complaint. Another said they had stopped planting flowers in their front yard after she left an anonymous note about non-approved landscaping. She had turned what should have been a friendly community into her personal kingdom, and she ruled with passive-aggressive notes, snide comments, and endless reports to the HOA board. The most telling part of her obsession was how she always seemed to think 2 steps ahead, as if plotting scenarios where she could corner someone for breaking a rule, no matter how minor. She thrived on confrontation, smiling sweetly in public while spreading rumors behind closed doors. To her, every neighbor was a suspect, and every garage, yard, or mailbox was a potential violation waiting to happen. I once overheard her bragging about how she had memorized the schedule of one family across the street so she could catch them leaving their trash bins out too long. It wasn't enough for her to keep her own property pristine. She wanted absolute control over everyone else's, and the way she talked about my house, you'd think I was running some sort of underground operation. She had mentioned more than once that my garage looked suspiciously secure, like the idea of me having a state-of-the-art system somehow threatened her unspoken authority. I could see it in her eyes, curiosity mixed with resentment, like she couldn't stand the fact that there was something in the neighborhood she didn't have access to. It ate at her, the thought that I had something she couldn't monitor, something beyond her control. For Karen, the worst possible scenario was being left out of the loop, and the fact that my garage was locked tighter than Fort Knox only made her obsession spiral deeper. Neighbors joked about how Karen probably had a master key to every house on the block, and while that was meant to be a joke, none of us would have put it past her. She carried herself like someone who believed the rules didn't apply to her, someone who could bend the system because she was the system. You could feel it in the way she stared at you when you pulled into your driveway, the way her lips curled into a smirk when she thought she had caught someone breaking an HOA guideline. It wasn't just about being a busybody. It was about feeding an insatiable need to be the one in control, to remind everyone that no matter what they did, Karen was watching. Karen's favorite trick was pretending that she had access to secret information no one else did, and nothing illustrated that better than her claim of having a so-called universal garage code. She dropped the idea in casual conversation like it was the most natural thing in the world, as if every HOA board member was given some magical sequence of numbers that could open any garage in the neighborhood. I still remember the first time she mentioned it, her voice laced with that smug confidence she always wore like a crown. "You'd be surprised what the HOA gives us access to," she said with a little laugh, her eyes glinting like she knew she had just planted a seed of unease. At first, most of us thought she was bluffing, that it was just another one of her scare tactics to make us believe she had more power than she really did. But as time went on, she repeated it often enough that some neighbors started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. It wasn't long before the rumor took on a life of its own. People whispered about whether Karen actually had the ability to waltz into their garages whenever she wanted. Some neighbors admitted they had started double-checking their locks at night, just in case. That was exactly what Karen wanted. The fear that she could be lurking, the idea that nothing in your own home was truly private. She didn't need to prove the existence of this so-called universal code. All she needed was for people to believe it. And believe me, she leaned hard into that belief. She'd make little comments like, "Oh, I noticed you moved some boxes in your garage." Even though she had no business knowing what was inside, it left people shaken, wondering how she could possibly know those details. And that doubt gave her even more control. The thing about Karen was that she never missed an opportunity to stir the pot. If a garage door was left open for a few minutes too long, she'd saunter over and say, "You know, anyone with the right code could just walk in," letting the words hang in the air with just enough weight to unsettle you. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Subtle enough to pass as idle chatter, but sharp enough to leave you second-guessing yourself long after she had walked away. She thrived on the unease, feeding off the way people tightened their lips and avoided eye contact after she made one of her sly remarks. In her mind, the universal code wasn't just a set of digits. It was a weapon, one she could use without ever actually producing evidence that it existed. I could see how much pride she took in that little game. The way she smirked when a neighbor nervously laughed off her comments. The way she lingered just a little too long by someone's garage door, as if daring them to ask her if she really knew the code. It was all a performance, and Karen was the star of her own twisted show. I started noticing patterns, the way she'd circle back to the topic of garage security, the way she spoke with absolute certainty that made her lies sound like gospel. She had perfected the art of manipulation, twisting the fear of the unknown into a leash she could tug on whenever she pleased. What really gave her away, though, was how her eyes always lit up when the conversation drifted toward my garage. She couldn't resist hinting that my system wasn't as foolproof as I thought. "You know, all these fancy setups aren't as secure as people believe," she told me once, leaning in like she was sharing a secret. "Sometimes it's the simplest codes that open the most complicated doors." She wanted me to believe she had an edge, that even my custom design wasn't beyond her reach. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a challenge, a test of whether her supposed universal code could crack what I had built with my own two hands. The way she spoke, it was clear that she had convinced herself she really did have access, and that made her more dangerous than if she had simply been lying. Neighbors started trading their own suspicions, some swearing they had heard garage doors opening late at night when no one was supposed to be home. Whether or not Karen was actually behind it didn't matter. The idea that she could be was enough to put everyone on edge. That was her real power, not the code itself, but the fear it inspired. And she knew it. Every time she mentioned the universal code, she wasn't just boasting about access. She was planting another seed of paranoia. And like any good gardener, she nurtured those seeds carefully, checking in just often enough to make sure they grew into full-blown anxiety. By the time she was finished, she had half the neighborhood convinced that their privacy could be violated at any moment. All because Karen couldn't stand the thought of anyone having a space she couldn't infiltrate. It happened on a night when the air was heavy with the kind of silence that makes you feel like something's about to go wrong. I had just finished locking up for the evening, my garage door sliding shut with the familiar hum of the custom system I had designed myself. To me, that sound was reassurance, proof that everything inside was safe and untouchable. But to Karen, it was an irresistible invitation. She had been circling my house for weeks, her eyes narrowing every time she walked past the driveway, her curiosity about what I kept behind that door growing like a fever she couldn't shake. And that night, she finally decided to act. She wasn't subtle about it either. She moved with the kind of false confidence that comes from convincing yourself you can't be caught. Maybe she thought her universal code would grant her instant entry, or maybe she simply couldn't resist proving to herself that she really had the power she claimed. I had noticed her lingering outside earlier in the day, pretending to check her mailbox while her gaze locked on my garage keypad. At the time, I brushed it off, figuring it was just another one of her little intimidation tactics. But hours later, well past midnight, I heard the faint crunch of gravel under shoes and knew immediately it wasn't an animal. I stayed quiet, my instincts telling me to listen before reacting, and sure enough, the faint beep of buttons being pressed followed. She was actually trying it. Standing there with her back straight, punching in numbers like she was entering the code to her own house. I could almost picture the smug grin she must have worn, convinced that her so-called universal access was about to swing open the very door I had designed to keep people like her out. It wasn't just the audacity that stunned me. It was the calmness with which she went about it. This wasn't a nervous neighbor sneaking where she didn't belong. This was someone who believed she had every right to be there. She wasn't breaking in, not in her mind. She was inspecting, monitoring, doing what she thought the HOA had silently appointed her to do. And as her fingers danced over the keypad, I realized she had probably rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head. Each click of a button was deliberate, her movements steady, like she was unlocking a door she already owned. She leaned in, probably waiting for the telltale hum of the mechanism, the sound that would prove she had outsmarted the system and gained entry into the one place she couldn't otherwise control for a split second. I wondered if she truly believed she had the right code, or if the whole thing was just a test to see how far she could push before I noticed. Either way, she was determined. When the door didn't budge on the first attempt, she didn't give up. She tried again, pressing another sequence, her fingers moving faster this time, her frustration starting to seep through. The faint glow of the keypad lit up her face, and I imagined her lips curling into that familiar scowl when the lock refused to give. She was in too deep now to turn back. She had committed to this break-in, and failure wasn't an option her pride would allow. I could almost hear her muttering under her breath, probably blaming me for being paranoid enough to build a system she couldn't crack with her imaginary universal code. The strange thing was how calm I remained. I had built that system for exactly this kind of situation, and watching her struggle against it was almost satisfying. She thought she was in control, that her reputation as the neighborhood watchdog gave her the upper hand. But in that moment, she was nothing more than a trespasser fumbling in the dark. Her attempts grew more desperate, her movements sharper, the beeps of failed codes echoing louder than I'm sure she intended. It was as if each failure chipped away at the illusion of power she had wrapped herself in for so long. Yet still she pressed on, convinced that the next sequence would finally unlock the door, that the victory she had been chasing was just one code away. I kept imagining what must have been running through her head. Maybe she pictured herself strolling into my garage, inspecting every corner with a smug smile, ready to report back to the HOA about what she found. Maybe she thought she'd discover something she could use against me, some imagined violation she could twist into leverage. Or maybe it wasn't about what was inside at all. Maybe the garage itself had become the prize, the one thing in the neighborhood she couldn't dominate, and cracking it would prove once and for all that nothing was beyond her reach. Whatever her reasoning, she was so caught up in her own fantasy that she didn't notice how the system she thought she was outsmarting was recording her every move. If there was one thing Karen hated, it was being shut out. And as I watched her stubbornly punch in code after code, it was clear she had no intention of leaving without getting what she came for. She was the kind of person who thrived on winning, even if she had to bend every rule to do it. And that night, she had convinced herself that victory was inevitable, that the universal code she bragged about would finally give her the key to the one place she had been desperate to control. The garage security system I had built wasn't just a standard lock and keypad setup. It was something I had poured weeks of planning into, customizing every detail so that no one could tamper with it without me knowing. I designed it to be more than a barrier. It was a trap for anyone foolish enough to try and get inside. The keypad looked ordinary on the outside, but behind its simple design was a complex network of sensors that could detect unusual patterns, repeated failed attempts, and even the subtle heat of someone standing too close for too long. I had rigged it to silently alert me whenever someone tried to force their way in, and Karen had walked right into its net like a moth to a flame. As she pressed in her so-called universal codes with growing impatience, the system quietly logged every entry attempt, feeding me a live notification that someone was at the garage. I had anticipated someone like her long before it ever happened. Karen wasn't the type to leave well enough alone, and the moment I caught her staring too long at the keypad during her daily patrols of the neighborhood, I knew it was only a matter of time before her curiosity tipped into action. So I built layers of protection she couldn't have imagined. The keypad was programmed to lock out completely after a certain number of failed attempts, and I had disguised additional sensors around the door frame that monitored for tampering. If she tried to force it, the alarm wouldn't sound loudly. No, that would have been too easy for her. Instead, the system would lock down silently, trapping her in a situation she thought she was controlling. She had no clue that every time her fingers jabbed at those glowing numbers, the system was not only rejecting her attempts but also snapping her picture through a concealed microcamera above the frame. The flash was invisible, the shutter silent, but the evidence was there, capturing her smug little face twisted with determination. I could see it from my phone in real time, the live feed showing her standing there like she owned the place. The irony was almost too perfect. Karen, who loved to expose other people's mistakes, was now being caught red-handed without realizing she was the star of her own scandal. The more she failed, the more frustrated she became. Her shoulders stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could tell from her body language that she was no longer just trying to prove a point. She was desperate. The system's subtle design worked against her pride. It didn't immediately alert her that she was locked out, instead allowing her to believe she still had a chance. So she kept going, convinced that victory was just one more code away. Meanwhile, the sensors were doing their job, tracking her every move, recording not just her attempts but the way she lingered, the way she leaned in close to the keypad as if her sheer willpower could force it open. I had also designed the garage door mechanism to give a faint, misleading click after multiple failed attempts. It wasn't an actual release of the lock, but it was enough to make someone think they were getting closer. That click was my favorite trick because it played with the intruder's mind, feeding them just enough hope to keep them trying. Karen fell for it exactly as I predicted, her face lighting up for a second before she quickly typed in another code. The click came again, and she leaned closer, her confidence returning for a brief moment. But the door never budged, and the more she tried, the more tangled she became in the system's web. I had her exactly where I wanted her, not just physically outside the garage, but mentally trapped in a spiral of false progress and growing panic. To make matters worse for her, the system wasn't just monitoring from the outside. Inside, motion sensors activated the moment she stepped close, and a faint, low-frequency alarm, inaudible to her but picked up by my device, confirmed that she had crossed the threshold of no return. I watched her pause, tilting her head slightly as if she sensed something was off but couldn't put her finger on it. That's when I knew the system had gotten under her skin. She thought she was outsmarting me, but in reality, she was walking deeper into a trap designed to expose her. Every second she spent at that keypad was more evidence stacking against her, proof that the queen of the HOA had crossed a line she could never erase. The beauty of it all was in the subtlety. There were no flashing red lights, no blaring sirens to scare her off, just quiet, invisible layers of defense that turned her confidence into overconfidence, her pride into a liability. She had no idea that her little mission of power was being dismantled piece by piece, recorded in perfect clarity, and stored away for the moment I'd need to show the neighborhood exactly who their self-appointed watchdog really was. Karen thought she had walked up to that garage ready to prove her superiority, but what she had actually done was step straight into the jaws of a system that had been waiting for her all along. The moment finally came when Karen realized something wasn't right. She had entered code after code, her fingers flying over the keypad with growing urgency, and still the door refused to budge. At first, she tried to hide her frustration, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching her struggle, but the truth was written all over her face. Her usual smug expression had been replaced by a mixture of irritation and disbelief, the kind of look you see when someone who thinks they're untouchable is suddenly confronted with the possibility that they've miscalculated. She pressed another sequence, waited for the faint click she had been hearing, and when nothing happened, her lips parted slightly as though the reality of her failure had finally sunk in. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and the realization hit her harder than she expected. Her body language betrayed her panic. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her arms folding and unfolding as if she couldn't decide whether to give up or keep trying. The subtle air of authority she always carried was slipping away, replaced by nervous energy. She tapped the keypad again, slower this time, almost pleading with the numbers to give her what she wanted. The soft glow of the digits reflected in her eyes, and I could tell she was second-guessing herself. The universal code she had boasted about for weeks wasn't working, and each failed attempt chipped another piece off the image she had worked so hard to project. In her mind, the neighborhood had always been her stage, and she the star, but standing there in the dim glow of the keypad, she looked less like a queen and more like an actor forgetting her lines. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she debated what to do next. Walking away would mean admitting defeat, something Karen's pride would never allow. But staying meant risking being caught, exposed as the fraud she really was. Her eyes darted toward the street, scanning for headlights or the faint movement of curtains, terrified someone might see her in the act. And yet, instead of leaving, she stayed rooted to the spot, caught between fear and stubbornness. It was clear she had convinced herself that one more attempt, just one more code, would turn everything around. But every time she punched in a new sequence, the door stayed firmly shut, and her breathing grew heavier with frustration. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. She leaned closer to the keypad, squinting at the numbers as though a new code might magically appear if she stared hard enough. Her fingers trembled as she entered another combination, and when the system responded with silence instead of the hum she expected, she froze. It was the kind of stillness that comes when someone realizes they've walked into a trap but are too proud to admit it. The security system had activated a subtle lockout by then, ensuring no matter how many codes she tried, the door wouldn't open. She pressed the keys again anyway, and when nothing happened, she stepped back, her face pale under the faint glow of the keypad. That was the exact moment the illusion shattered. The point where Karen's carefully crafted power crumbled in the face of reality. Her expression told the whole story. The confident tilt of her chin was gone, replaced by wide eyes that flicked back and forth as if searching for an explanation. She muttered something under her breath, maybe a curse or an excuse, but whatever it was, it carried none of the authority she usually wielded. She looked smaller somehow, her frame hunched, her hands fidgeting at her sides. I imagined the thoughts racing through her head, that maybe the code wasn't as universal as she believed, that maybe she had been lied to, or worse, that she had finally overplayed her hand. The woman who had spent years making the entire neighborhood bend to her will was now standing outside my garage, powerless and exposed. It wasn't just the door she couldn't open. It was the realization that her influence had limits. For so long, she had relied on intimidation, on whispers and rumors, on the fear she could instill with nothing more than a few well-placed words. But fear doesn't open doors, and no amount of arrogance could override a system built to resist her. I watched her shift again, her hands balling into fists before falling limply at her sides. A quiet admission of defeat, even if she would never say it out loud. She was caught in a moment she couldn't control, a moment that stripped away the veneer of authority she had worked so hard to maintain. Her panic deepened when she realized she had been standing there longer than she intended. She glanced around again, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling quickly now as the thought of being discovered seemed to weigh heavier than the thought of failing. Every second stretched out like an eternity, the silence around her thick enough to suffocate. She reached for the keypad one last time, her hand hesitating in the air, then dropped it, finally understanding that no amount of persistence would make the door open. The universal code she had so proudly boasted about had proven useless, and the system she thought she could beat had outsmarted her without breaking a sweat. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire, and by morning, everyone seemed to know that Karen had been caught red-handed outside my garage. I hadn't even needed to share all the details myself. The sight of her skulking back home that night, looking shaken and defeated, had been enough to set tongues wagging. Neighbors who had once cowered under her watchful glare suddenly found the courage to speak up, whispering about how the so-called queen of the HOA had finally stumbled. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen, who had built her entire reputation on controlling others and enforcing rules, had been exposed as the one breaking them. The very woman who had shamed families for leaving their trash bins out too long or planting the wrong kind of flowers was now the subject of hushed conversations and sideways glances every time she stepped outside. The fallout wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about credibility. Karen had spent years cultivating the image of being untouchable, someone with invisible connections and supposed authority that no one dared to challenge. But when people learned she had tried to break into my garage using a universal code that didn't even exist, that carefully crafted image cracked like thin glass. The whispers grew louder, turning into full-blown conversations at neighborhood gatherings and over backyard fences. For once, Karen wasn't the one pointing fingers. She was the one being judged. And the more she tried to act as if nothing had happened, the more obvious it became that her power was slipping away. Neighbors began sharing their own stories, things they had been too afraid to say out loud before. One couple admitted they'd caught Karen lingering near their backyard gate late at night. Another revealed she had left passive-aggressive notes about their lawn furniture placement. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, painting a picture of someone who had been pushing boundaries far longer than anyone had realized. Suddenly, the woman who had once seemed like a figure of authority looked more like a nosy busybody who had finally gone too far. Even those who had once sided with her for fear of being her next target started to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose schemes had been dragged into the light. The HOA board, which Karen had always claimed to have special ties to, couldn't ignore the growing storm either. They began receiving complaints not just about the garage incident but about her behavior as a whole. People wanted answers. Was she really given special codes? Did she actually have the right to patrol the neighborhood like some self-appointed sheriff? The truth, of course, was no. She had been bluffing all along, feeding the rumor of her so-called universal code to keep people in line. But now that the lie had been exposed, the board was forced to confront the reality that Karen had manipulated the community into fearing her. I could see the change in her every time she walked down the street. The confident stride she had once carried was gone, replaced with quick steps and eyes that darted nervously from side to side. She still tried to hold her chin high, but the weight of the whispers and the sideways glances pulled it down little by little. Neighbors who used to nod politely now crossed the street to avoid her, their conversations trailing off as she approached. Children who had once been shushed by their parents in her presence now giggled openly, repeating the story they had overheard their parents telling. Karen had gone from being the neighborhood watchdog to the punchline of every whispered joke, and she couldn't stand it. The more she tried to regain control, the worse it became. She attempted to call emergency meetings, sending out passive-aggressive emails about community safety, but the responses were lukewarm at best. The same people who used to jump at her every word now ignored her messages, some even unsubscribing from the HOA's mailing list altogether. It was clear she no longer held the grip she once did, and the harder she fought to keep it, the faster it slipped through her fingers. The garage incident had stripped her of the one thing she relied on more than anything else: fear. Without it, she was just another neighbor, and not a very well-liked one at that. What struck me most was how quiet she became. For someone who once made it her mission to control every little detail, she suddenly had very little to say. No more clipboard walks, no more measuring tape at fences, no more snide remarks about lawn care or Christmas decorations. It was as if the weight of being caught had finally silenced her, forcing her into the background of the very neighborhood she had once dominated. And while she tried to put on a brave face, I could see it every time she glanced at my garage when she thought no one was looking. That mix of resentment and humiliation, knowing she had been beaten at her own game too.